Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're just waiting for more people to be added to the webinar. So we'll just get started in just a minute. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks again for joining us for the third webinar in the Indigenous Data Management series. I'm Lauren Bosk. I'm a program officer in the research office at the University of Winnipeg. And I wanted to start again today by acknowledging that where I'm located as an uninvited settler of French and Finnish descent in Winnipeg is on the birthplace and homeland of the Métis Nation, the Chif, and on the traditional territory of the Kishaadigeh, Ojibwe, Nahiawak, Cree, and the Anishinaabe, Oji Cree people, and a place of importance for the Oyate, Dakota, and Dene Dene peoples. This is Treaty 1 territory. I also acknowledge Treaty 3 and the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation area, which is where we get our water supply. Finally, I'd like to remind you of the resource connecting us today. Approximately 70% of Manitoba's electricity comes from Nelson River in northern Manitoba, located in Treaty 5. I do this acknowledgement to commemorate Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land, which has been restricted. The process of land acknowledgements is inspired by the 94 recommended calls to action, which are contained in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report. Land acknowledgements are a necessary first step towards honoring the original occupants of a place, and I encourage all of you to learn about the land you are situated on. This series is hosted by Kishaadigeh, the Manitoba Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research, or NEAR, based at the University of Winnipeg. Kishaadigeh is funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, and it aims to upskill research capacity and infrastructure for Indigenous communities and organizations undertaking health research in Manitoba. Kishaadigeh focuses on promoting Indigenous self-determination in research through the development of community-based research lodges in partnership with 5 Manitoba Indigenous organizations: the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba, the Manitoba Association of Friendship Centers, the Manitoba Inuit Association, the Aboriginal Health and Wellness Center, and Fearless R2W. Data, and by extension, data management, is really about sharing and protecting stories. Both as an institution and through the NEAR program, we want to support Indigenous community partners to ensure they have full ownership over their own stories and data. This series, which is hosted by Kishaadigeh and supported by SSHRC and the University of Winnipeg Library, was built with that in mind, and we hope you'll continue to learn alongside us from our presenters throughout this series. Information on upcoming webinars and free registration links can be found under the news section of the Manitoba NEAR website. And as you can see in the chat, our wonderful Larissa has posted a link to the previous webinars in the series. And on the same website under the news section, you can see the upcoming webinars, which she's also posted. Thank you so much, Larissa. It's also on Kishaadigeh and Manitoba NEAR's social media platforms as well. As you saw as you joined, this live session is recorded and will be made available under resources and webinars of the NEAR's website shortly after the presentation. Just a few minor housekeeping matters before we get started. There will be a short post-webinar survey. We would really appreciate you taking the time to complete this, because alongside this webinar series, we are developing an Indigenous community-based research data management toolkit, which we plan to release next year. The survey will really help inform the development of the toolkit, especially if there are places in the series that we can clarify or expand upon. So please send us your feedback. That'll really help with the development of this toolkit. Feel free to add your questions into the Q&A feature or the chat at any time. I'll be taking a look at both of those and monitoring them. And following the presentation from our presenter today, I will pose them for discussion. We'll also make sure to leave some space for you to gather your thoughts and type out your questions after the presentation as well. Finally, please sign up for future webinars in this series. And as Larissa has posted, you can take a look at the full list on the NEAR website. Those who are able to attend all 6 of the webinars will receive a certificate of completion for the training. Okay, so finally, I'm now delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Walker. Dr. Walker is a Haudenosaunee member of 6 Nations of the Grand River with a PhD in Community Health Sciences in Epidemiology from the University of Calgary. Dr. Walker's work focuses largely on Indigenous community engaged health research using large health services databases through her work as a core scientist and Indigenous health lead at ICES in Ontario through the Health Data Research Network Canada. So Jennifer, thank you and welcome, and I will pass it off to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's really nice to be here. I think when I heard about this series happening, I was more excited than anyone because I feel like I have so much to learn from it. And then to be invited to speak in it is quite an honor. So thank you for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to share. So hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here with you. I'm just going to begin doing the technical bits of sharing my screen and getting set up here. There we go. My task is to sort of shift us in this series, I think, to thinking about research data management practices and how they can be indigenized and decolonized. Now, this is no small task to have been invited to speak about. And, you know, I do a lot of thinking about this, though. So I probably have some perspectives, but also a lot to learn from, you know, the discussion that we have later. But in my role at ICES, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we go, ICES is where the large administrative databases are. So if you go to the hospital or the doctor or and records of those encounters with the healthcare system are stored and linked together. For years, those data have been used for informing the healthcare system in Ontario. But in only recent years have First Nations and the Métis Nation of Ontario sort of found ways to unlock that and establish strong data governance arrangements with ICES so that the data can be responsibly and safely used to answer questions about First Nations and the Métis Nation in Ontario. So that's the context in which I often think about data. But in many of the other projects that I work in, you know, in research projects where we're doing primary data collection, there's also a lot to think about in terms of research data management. So I guess just to highlight that there's certainly a diversity of types of data, but that we have to think about those principles that we can base this whole thing on. So I'm actually coming to you from Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. I'm in the treaty area, the Dish with One Spoon treaty area. So I've recently moved to McMaster University. Perhaps the last time we saw each other, if we've met before, I was at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, and I've recently taken a position at McMaster University, so I kind of moved home, which is pretty exciting. So we're going to talk a little bit about research data management, continuing with the theme of the whole series. Just a little bit about what it is, but really what are those processes? What does it mean to decolonize research data management? What does it mean to indigenize research data management? Are those, you know, how do those things, how are they distinct concepts and where do they intersect? Also some really like those Indigenous grounded principles for research data management, some examples where we see that in action, and then how do we move forward with Indigenous approaches to research data management. So just starting generally about research data management, it's about organizing and maintaining research data through a project's life cycle. So it's all those policies, practices, processes that are involved in the collection, the storage, the representation, the analysis, all of that cycle of from collecting to sharing research data. And so, you know, it's not when we're thinking about it, particularly when I'm working with Indigenous nations and they're thinking about it, they're not just thinking about the raw data sets where you've got like one line per person and it shows, you know, the experiences of an individual or an encounter with the healthcare system. It actually does encompass like even aggregate data. It encompasses, so even once you kind of collapse it and you sort of group it and combine it, so you're just talking about like, you know, women age 45 to 55, and you don't know who the individuals are. Even when it's in that form, even when it's in its forms of where it's almost ready to be shared, at all stages, we're really thinking about what are the processes for managing that data and what governance needs to be in place, what kind of storage needs to be in place throughout that whole research data lifecycle. So I'm previewing a little too far here, but I just want to say that data are collected within knowledge systems. So you can't disentangle data. Data are not neutral. So they are collected within knowledge systems that are sometimes very disparate and sometimes they overlap. So when we think about data that are collected in Western knowledge systems, there's been a recent movement to sort of open data and really like these principles have really got a lot of traction. So just look at the top part of the screen right now. These principles of data being findable, stored in ways that are findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. So the idea that research data shouldn't, this in Western knowledge systems, the research data shouldn't be collected and used only just once for one research project. It should be available to advance science, advance knowledge for all sorts of people to use in environments of open data where you've got innovation happening worldwide. So these are the kinds of words you'll hear people talking about when they're talking about open data. There's a lot of energy and excitement around the FAIR principles and the concepts of open data. In the context of that, so I am very, very lucky to be part of a group that is associated with an organization called Research Data Alliance, and it's an international organization that is an Indigenous data working group, thinking about how do those principles intersect with our knowledge systems around the world, but Indigenous knowledge systems. So I'm not talking just about Haudenosaunee knowledge systems or Anishinaabe or Dakota knowledge systems, I'm talking about like even just like this like broad difference between Western knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge systems. And so we wanted to balance out those principles of open data and really start to think about, okay, that's wonderful, but when you have Indigenous data, then you need another layer. It's not okay to just say anybody can access this data to be used in innovative and creative ways that may tell a story that doesn't align with our knowledge systems, or may be used in ways that don't advance our sovereignty or our self-determination. And so this balance to this is this idea of okay, this be fair and care. So this idea of collective benefit, the authority to control the data, responsibility and ethics. I'm going to get a little bit more in depth into those principles if I have time, but one way or another, there's a little link there right here. And if you go there, then you can see these principles all broken out and descriptions of them. And so my point here is really about these knowledge systems. So we have, and we don't want to make false dichotomies of things and make things seem more different than they actually are. But so we need to find that space where we can work with data that, okay, set it up so that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but ensure that there's Indigenous governance and control, that it's being used for collective benefit, and that there's an ability for the nations to tell that story with the data. So if we think about the concept of decolonizing and the concept of indigenizing. So when I think about decolonizing, just so you know where I come from when I think about it, I think about a research data management system that exists maybe at ICES, for example, and that within sort of this, Western knowledge system, the way the data are collected, the things we collect about the encounters with the healthcare system. So who decided that what we count is, certain number of diagnoses, we count the time that people spend in the emergency department, we count certain things, we choose what to count. Those are value decisions about what to count. So we have this research data management structure, what's counted, how we store the data, who gets to decide how it's used. And then we do that work to decolonize that existing structure. We do that work to question it, to unsettle it. So decolonization has been defined as work toward disassembling settler supremacy by decentering and dismantling colonial institutions, modalities, systems, structures, ways of knowing and being that continue to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands, families, homes, languages, and rights. So if you think about the ways that data have been used to continue to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their rights and their sovereignty, their self-determination, then you can see that the hard work of decolonizing those systems is one side of what needs to happen. When I think about indigenizing research data management, I think about this process where we're starting fresh, where we're saying, based on our knowledge systems, we're not starting with a data management system that needs to be decolonized. We're starting with our knowledge systems and saying, how do we build Indigenous research data management approaches that align with, Haudenosaunee Confederacy governance, for example, or how do we build it in ways that align with our knowledges? And so indigenization is a process that centers the politics of Indigenous identity and cultural action and privileges Indigenous voices. So it centers and strengthens Indigenous views and methods. So where the process of decolonizing was sort of trying to, taking a Western-centered approach and decolonizing, this is building an Indigenous-centered approach. So I think that those two processes are actually, obviously they intersect, but they are quite different. I have to say I spend probably like 80% of my life on the decolonizing side, and I so long for spending time on the indigenizing side. So I probably have more to say and share about decolonizing than I do about building anew, but that's what I'm really excited about. That's where I get really excited. So we think about how we can build, why, I guess not how, but at this point, why we need to build data systems that are Indigenous centered, is because what we are trying to do is make sure that we are grounding ourselves in Indigenous knowledges, and that we are also not interfering with Indigenous nationhood and rights. So to build Indigenous nation sovereignty, you have to have governance over data, but you also have to use that data for governance. So that's the full cycle, right? There's a responsibility that we have also. The responsibility that Indigenous nations have is to govern their data, and the responsibilities that data holders have is to make that space to create that environment where there is Indigenous governance of Indigenous data. But then the second part of that responsibility on Indigenous nations is to use that data for governance, and no one else can do that. So that's the really key part. So if you think about grounding ourselves in those Indigenous knowledges and making sure that when we're building our research data management systems, that we are building Indigenous research data management systems, I think it's important to think about what knowledge is. Like, what are we? What is it that's in the data? It's our knowledge and our realities. And I think about this idea of water a lot when I'm thinking about knowledge. And I think that this quote from Sean Wilson is important. For us, the ceremony is about a story. And for all of those, you have to let it flow because it's built on relationships. And when you use a story, your own or others, it's claiming a voice and establishing a relationship. So that knowledge needs to, the idea of knowledge, it needs to flow, right? We can't just have knowledge all sitting like water in one vessel that doesn't flow to where it needs to go and where it needs to touch. So we have to build systems that are not so ironclad that knowledge can't flow. Knowledge has to flow so that we can tell our stories and that we can build those relationships of trust so that our stories can be shared with ourselves, with one another, and that we can continue to flow and change and nourish new parts of our societies with our knowledge. But it just, if we build our structures so tight that the data can't be used or the stories can't be told, then I don't think we're honoring what we know about knowledge and what we know about the purpose of stories and knowledge. So research data management is guided by Indigenous communities' ways of being, ways of knowing, how research is conducted, ethics, and values. So an Indigenous view of what makes evidence and ethical research really determines the approach that's taken to answer a study question, including the data collection and management methods employed. So think about, I mean, some of my colleagues internationally are thinking about also like things like having a traditional knowledge. I can't remember the right word for it, but it's like a digital marker. It's like a digital tag saying that this is Indigenous knowledge. And so it has to be traced back to where that knowledge came from before it can be shared. That those voices need to come through. And you can think about so many ways that applies. I think about it all the time because I can't, I'm starting to think, okay, I'm going to do a literature review on something because, it's COVID and it's very hard to do primary data collection right now. So I'm going to do a systematic review. All those, so let's say I'm including 15 studies in a systematic review. Every one of those studies comes from somewhere. Every one of those studies has data that's grounded in knowledge from a certain place, from communities and from knowledge keepers or from experiences with certain communities. How do we make sure we trace that back? And those communities know that we're telling their story as part of a bigger story later. I'm just thinking so much about where the data flows, like how do we, once it's not in that closed vessel anymore and it is flowing, which is part of our ways of knowing, like trickling out that knowledge is really important. But how do we make sure that it's governed the right way, and that that knowledge still can be traced to where it started, and we don't lose the context as we summarize things, as we take it potentially out of context, like in processes like knowledge synthesis processes, or you know, data analysis process where we're pooling a lot of things together. I think that, you know, I already talked about not interfering. And I think this is something that I often want to emphasize with organizations that hold data about Indigenous people, nations, lands, that the two-row wampum agreement is an agreement that says that settlers and all their knowledge systems and languages and governance structures will travel in one of those two rows, and that Indigenous knowledge systems and governance, I'm really simplifying this, but that we can, without interfering with one another, travel along the same path. I think that what we have to do when we come to that realization that, oh my goodness, my university is holding data about Indigenous people without any Indigenous governance or knowledge about what to do with that data, at a nation level or at a community level, without because, you know, what we're talking about here is collective consent and collective rights to that we're not interfering with that sovereignty, that self-determination, and those collective rights. So those are in our original agreements, those sort of like, you know, early treaties, those peace and friendship treaties where we talked about our relationship to one another. So we think about Western knowledge systems sort of usurping that, taking over it. It doesn't follow our original treaties. So we have to step back from that and say, what did it mean to not interfere? What did it mean to have our own knowledge systems that weren't you know, jumping from line to line on the two-row treaty? There's also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, if we think about that non-interference with rights. And those rights can very clearly help guide us in our decisions about research data management. For example, obviously the right to self-determination, autonomy, and self-government, and the right to maintain distinct institutions are all really important to honoring the fact that there needs to be a layer of Indigenous governance over Indigenous data. But then also just some of these other ones, including the right to determine their own identity or membership. So really understanding the complexity of that. I think we all can agree that that's a pretty complex thing road to travel. But as we're moving towards, you know, having a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in Canada, we need to understand how this will guide the way we store our data, the way we collect it, store it, use it, access it. These rights have to be maintained as we think about, and it'll be law. These rights have to be maintained in the way that we develop our research data management practices. These are just other ways of thinking about it, other sort of, for hard to convince people that it's really important to be thinking about the rights, those constitutional and treaty rights, right to self-determination, inherent right of self-government, and just these the nation-to-nation agreements and distinctions-based approaches that are really that also maybe need to guide us. So at ICES, for example, we have unique governance agreements with the Chiefs of Ontario and several other First Nations governance organizations. And we have a distinct and completely separate stream of work and a governance agreement with the Métis Nation, because those that approach was really important for First Nations and Métis, partly in that, just to return back, determining their own identity or membership. So we did that, well, because they are distinct relationships between ICES and Indigenous nations, First Nations and Métis Nation, but also because the Métis Nation has a citizenship registry, and that's how they define their population, and that's what they want to link in with the data to tell their story. First Nations have other ways of doing that. The primary way at ICES, the primary way that we're doing that right now for all of Ontario studies is with the Indian Register, the Federal Indian Register, and linking that in. But individual communities will have different ways that they want to do that. And so, you know, we have to build in those unique rights, interests, and circumstances for First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. We are working with Inuit organizations in Ontario, and working with Inuit data with a whole other set of principles underlying that are Inuit knowledge principles. So coming back to the, you know, the idea of fair and care, be fair and care, I was going to dive a little bit more detail into those principles, but I think in the interest of, I will do it at the end if I don't, so that I don't mess up the flow of trying to share something new. But it's really directly off this website. There's a PDF I was going to take you to, which I may still end up being able to show you at the end. But really just like, there's points under each of these things that can really help to ground and guide decisions about how data need to be set up. I want to just emphasize that those care principles are like they're international, global principles for Indigenous data that were developed in multiple places with multiple nations. But it doesn't undermine the OCAP principles. Immediately, if you were following the care principles, you would be directed to OCAP if you're working with First Nations data. It would be the path that takes someone who doesn't know to OCAP, because the main thing is centering the way that the nations that are whom the data exists, that their data governance principles are the ones that are primarily that are given priority. And so I'm sure there's a high level of familiarity with OCAP, these principles of First Nations ownership, control, access, and possession over First Nations data. They were actually, it's not quite true to say they're developed through the First Nations Information Governance Center, because they kind of predated the First Nations Information Governance Center, but they are sort of administered through well, they own the trademarks, so I'm not really sure the right wording to say, but it refers to those rights of First Nations, and it's basically the way that First Nations are asserting rights to data, especially data that are collected about First Nations need to make sure that they that they embed this First Nations ownership, control, access, and possession over the data. Now, I'm going to just tell you that I find this very complex. Like, it sounds simpler than it is in practice. There's a variety of I shouldn't say a variety, there's a diversity and like a wide spectrum of interpretations of OCAP, community interpretations, nation interpretations, organizations interpretations of OCAP. The way that we're working on OCAP at ICES right now, not everyone agrees with. And it's one of those things where, because we are also working in a system where we are decolonizing an existing system, right? So we have a system, there's a legal framework in Ontario for data that ICES has to follow. And then we're trying to decolonize that, but we can't do things that are illegal. So that really interferes with possession. So, we say we are embedding OCAP into our data governance agreements, but we are not allowed to send raw data out of ICES. I'm not allowed to see a lot of the raw data at ICES, although I'm a core scientist there. Like there's very strict privacy and confidentiality controls over the data at ICES. So we get to the point where it's sort of like, well, we can work with you to answer a question, and then we'll send you, aggregate data, or we'll send you, or you can sort of come into the ICES environment, and then you can work with the data yourself. So we're working we have to work within multiple frames, I guess, is what I want to say about this. So I think that's one of the central challenges to the process of decolonizing and indigenizing research data management, is that we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're doing this within the context of quite established Western ideas of about research data management practices, and evolving. And it really, like, research data management is an evolving practice. I just joined McMaster University, and immediately it was like, okay, you're on the research data management working group. I was like, oh no, there's so many people thinking about this and what to do next and how to do it and how to comply, but how to move forward on some of these ideas like Indigenous data sovereignty and honor those. So yeah, while they seem quite simple, they've set a line for what the expectations of First Nations are with respect to data about First Nations. But there's a lot of that line is also sometimes, I don't know, it's not a steel fence, it's more like a rope. So that sometimes it moves around obstacles, or sometimes it's not quite clear where that line is. At ICES, we developed this framework for working with First Nations data, and then it became sort of more generalized as we kept working, but really centering those Indigenous data governance principles. And for First Nations, that's OCAP, and working on having a balanced approach between having solid, strong, binding data governance agreements within the context of privacy legislation and all of those things, formalized, and those ongoing ethical relationships. So not, relying just on the data governance agreements, not relying just on the relationships, but having that balance between those two things have to go hand in hand. So that we are, just moving down to the bottom there, that we are working on evidence to build policies and programs, that there's something relevant about what we're doing. It's somehow applied and useful. And to do that, we've got two forms of work. One is having, researchers who are working with communities, researchers like me sometimes, who are working with communities who are asking questions, and then like you're doing a research project together. And then another model where communities don't need a researcher, they just come straight to ICES and say, we want to know our diabetes rates, and we want to know our COVID testing rates. We want to know, we want monthly reports on how many people have been vaccinated, or that kind of thing. So then we can honor those requests directly. But that all along we're thinking, continuing to try and think critically about Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous identities, the data gaps in quality, and the work that we're doing, and aligning that with Indigenous methodology. So that's one example. This is one of the things that we've been working, that one of the ways that someone has been working, and that someone is me, but there's others, and this is a review, and I don't know if it's already come up for you before, but there was a scoping review done of data management in health-related research involving Indigenous communities in the United States and Canada. And so what I want to say about the findings of that review is that a few key points. One, that data management encompasses all of these things. It's not just the storage of data. It's not just data storage and security and data sharing. It's including the dissemination of results. It's including all of that process. And it also, this community engagement and community level governance are distinct but connected. Okay, so sometimes at ICS, for example, we have there's a First Nations data governance committee. Sometimes they approve studies that they are not involved in, and sometimes that the Chiefs of Ontario are not involved in, for example, and sometimes Chiefs of Ontario is actually engaged in the research. Sometimes it's someone else who's engaged in the research. So I guess I just want to highlight that distinction, that like permission from a data governance committee is not engagement. There is, and engagement and governance and have to encompass all of those processes: data collection, analysis, storage, sharing, return and dissemination of results, and data withdrawal and disposal. All of those things have to have both community engagement and research governance. And then they have OCAP around the outside. It's a very helpful review. There's a couple of other examples where there's some great efforts that have been made to do this in the best way possible. So one is the First Nations Healthy Hearts and Minds cohort study. They have data management and security protocols that have both that community engagement and community governance, and they host a hands-on data analysis training for communities, so that there's the capacity building part built in, and so that it's not just some, like you're asking people questions about how the data should be stored and shared without people understanding what the data feels like and looks like and is. There's another example that came up, that comes up around Arctic sea ice mapping, and they published these tenets of an Indigenous research paradigm and how they could be applied in developing Indigenous data management practices. And so you can see some of those really important, like they go through like the sort of things that need to be part of a research paradigm, like respect, reciprocity, responsibility, some of those principles there, and then how to do it in the other column there. So really, this is also a really helpful example of someone who is of a team that's really dug deep in trying to understand how their data management can be developed from an Indigenous worldview, rather than developing something and then needing to decolonize it later. So some of the things that come to mind as challenges is that, that I've come across are things like in mixed data systems where you have Indigenous and non-Indigenous data, sometimes things need to be stored separately, right? Like stored on a separate server or stored in a different virtual area. This is my technical knowledge coming through, but stored in an area where there's security safeguards so that it's very clear that the access to that data is restricted. And then the idea of actually setting up separate Indigenous data storage systems. In data archiving, this is something that comes up at ICS quite commonly, and that's because we have this archiving process where things get, after a while, like the tables and outputs from the SAS programming or R program, those research outputs are saved, and then they're archived, and then eventually they're like on a physical tape somewhere being stored. What happens when a community partner says, that project we did 5 years ago? I want you to erase all of it. Give it back to us and erase all of it. And it's like, whoa, that's in like a warehouse on a tape. It's pretty complex to actually think about how to do this, especially in this era where we're saving things for a long time. It's not the same as, like, okay, the project's over, the papers are written, we're deleting all the data or all the research outputs and everything. Like, it's unusual to have that situation where you would delete absolutely everything from start to finish. Sometimes people are sort of deleting the raw data, but like all those tables and outputs, and how does that happen when some of it's been published? Like it's that tracing and the responsibility for tracing is very important to think about at the beginning. So that idea of having those digital tags on things about where they came from, so that you can trace it back, you can trace where it goes forward, and you can trace from your present back in time, so that where things have gone and where they're going. So this is why there's a research data management working group at McMaster, and that's because there's a tri-agency, so CIHR, SSHRC, and NSERC, which are the big research funding agencies in Canada policy. They actually say that the policy has to aligns with the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. So that's something you need to be aware of. So for funded research. And that, and OCAP for First Nations data governance. So in summary, and I want to learn even more, but these Indigenous principles for research data management, they really are and have to be grounded in Indigenous knowledges, sovereignty, and rights. They have to be always built with the mind to self-determination and sovereignty and Indigenous knowledges. The principles that we have so far to guide us, which there are some frameworks that I've shown that can help to guide researchers and communities make decisions about how to retain, secure, preserve, and control access to data in ways that honor First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, protocols, values, and priorities. But there's never going to be one way to do it. It's going to take, so the efforts to make sure that things are interoperable, but at the same time community-based. This is hard work we have in front of us. But in the end, the spirit of Indigenous principles have to be central. And when we're working in legislative frameworks or policies of research granting agencies, we have to resist the approach of building something and decolonizing it later, and turn to building Indigenous research data management structures from the start. I just want to really highlight the amazing people who are to come in this series. And I'm excited about it, and I hope people will continue to attend. And I think we have a little bit of time for discussion. So I just want to say thank you, Yahweh, for the opportunity to come and speak.
Thank you so much to you, Jennifer, for speaking today. There's a bunch of questions that have started coming in, so I'm very excited to share these with you and get your thoughts on them. The first two questions, they actually kind of work in tandem, and it's about addressing kind of the colonial and settler institutions that many of us reside within. And so the first question, I'll just read it. It's from an anonymous attendee, and it reads, the majority of university research in Canada is designed and controlled under the university system that operates under the colonial settler law and governance. Could you share some practical examples or approaches about how we can apply care principles or OCAP principles for research with Indigenous peoples and the data generated in the process? So thinking about kind of that decolonizing framework you were talking about and those steps to take those Western systems and really, practical ways that we can think about research and data management.
So if we're talking about, so I want to make sure that I got the question right and that I don't answer a different question just because I thought I heard a question. But is it about the legal frameworks and stuff, or is it about the data structures?
Well, I think the question is talking about the systems that we operate as researchers under with the colonial or settler law and governance. How do we kind of take that into consideration and applying care principles and OCAP principles for research with Indigenous peoples and the data that gets generated?
Okay, yeah, so I think that it has to be, that's why in that framework that we have at ICS, we have both the data governance agreements that articulate things and the relationships, because there are times where, like I said, that OCAP line has to go around obstacles. And so when there's trust and relationships built, because you say you can't, there's a certain point at which you can possess the data, but before that, it's too raw, and it's too, we're not legally allowed to send it. So we work through those things where then we have the data governance agreement. So as soon as the data is stored in any way associated with a person's identity as a First Nations person, or that if it's used, if their address is used to identify them as someone who lives on reserve or any of those things, as soon as that happens, the data governance agreement kicks in. So the relationships and agreements are the way that we've used to kind of work through those systems where we say, okay, we recognize our legal obligations to the government of Ontario, to the people of Ontario, all these things, but we also recognize our obligations to reconciliation, to Indigenous sovereignty. And so we do that through governance agreements, is the way we've been working.
Yeah, and I wonder, the next question is specifically about the systems and thinking about data management plans in those systems. And so the question is, are research data management plans by their nature a Western system, since they are organized in relation to Western-based universities and granting agencies? So the question is there a way to perhaps make this, make data management plans a two-eyed seeing approach?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think that honestly, a two-eyed, okay. I think you should center the Indigenous approaches in that, actually. If you're going to be starting anew, start with Indigenous knowledges and approaches and perspectives. Research data management, by its nature, doesn't have to be Western focused, I don't think. Just because we're digitizing information doesn't mean that it's not Indigenous knowledge anymore, or Indigenous experience. So I think that building those systems in different ways requires like a lot of capacity, actually, like a lot of understanding of data, a lot of technical understanding of systems and like computer technologies and servers and making sure that there's clear that we understand where the water is going to flow, where the knowledge is going to flow, and what's okay and what's not, and what those gates will look like. But I think that like a two-eyed seeing approach is it often runs the risk of sort of ending up being sort of like a Western approach that has a little bit of Indigenous approaches baked in. So I'm just saying that it tends to run that risk. So I would just say, we're centering Indigenous approaches here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. One of the next questions is about archives. And the question is, where do archives that hold historical Indigenous health data, so for example, patient files from Indian hospitals, fall into your work, or kind of generally thinking about data management?
I don't know where they fall into my work. I haven't accessed them before. But that's exactly, so in my mind though, like there are contemporary examples where just by the nature of where health services were received, that those are Indigenous people receive, and so those are Indigenous stories. So by its nature, that's Indigenous data and needs to have governance and all of the things that we talked about have to be in place in any kind of use, access, storage of that. I don't actually know a lot about where those data are stored and how they're accessed and used, but if we apply the principles we've talked about, they are 100% Indigenous data, even though, they may be, the federal government may feel like that's their data. If we're thinking about our frame for what is Indigenous data, it's Indigenous data.
Mm-hmm. Great. The next question is about RDM in urban Indigenous settings versus rural settings. And the question is, are there any differences or similarities in working between kind of rural settings or urban Indigenous settings?
Well, rural is a funny way of thinking about it. I'm not sure you mean rural or you mean like in First Nation communities. The data in First Nation communities has in many ways a clearer, often a clearer governance because they're sort of like still organized as distinct nations, even though there may be some elected governance and traditional governance and things like that to work out. There's still sort of more clear lines to governance and like an authority in some way, the authority. But so in urban, where you have more diverse nations all together, then there is a complexity there. And so in my work, depending on which partner I'm working with, they will think of that differently. So when I'm working with First Nations directly, no matter where I live, Six Nations sees me as one of their members, right? So when I lived in Sudbury, they still want to count me because I'm one of their members. So they see me as a member of Six Nations. Whereas, maybe the Sudbury Indigenous community also sees me as one of their community members. So there's like a little bit of difference in perspective on governance that I'm not, that is something complex to work through. So there's just not a clear line. And so it really depends on the perspectives of the nations and groups that you're working with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just want to say that we have a number of questions, but we are kind of at the top of our time. So I'm going to maybe ask one more question, and then if anyone has direct questions for you, I'm assuming they can do you feel comfortable with people reaching out to you, or maybe through Kishaadigeh, the questions can be sent our way and we can kind of pass them along. But there's two questions that I'm going to kind of blend together. The first is, they're just about Indigenous data governance working in a kind of a large administrative data set. And so can you speak about how Indigenous data governance may work in a system that includes a survey, for example, with demographic information, and they're kind of large data sets? Maybe there are no spots or no fields for, you know, Indigenous status or identification. And so do you have strategies in thinking about kind of, yeah, data governance and kind of these large data sets with a bunch?
So there's a lot to unpack there. So maybe combining them made more to unpack, but I'm not sure. I'll just try and answer for those people who can stay. I understand people have to go. So I think that, like, in large data sets, if there's not identifiers, then there are ways of establishing like some knowledge about who's Indigenous. So for example, we can, like, even without like First Nations, the Indian register, even without that, you can work with an individual community and say, well, what's your postal code and who do you want to count and how do you want to do that to define your community, right? So that's, but it's really important that that's guided by and driven by that nation. But the other thing is that there's also, like, data linkage is how we mainly do that. So understanding who the members are of the community that is trying to access the data, and then linking in that membership list or something like that is a good way to do it. Janet Smiley has done quite a bit of work to do approaches. They're not really, it is survey, but it's the sampling is different. It's not a random sample, but it's like a respondent driven sample to find Indigenous people in cities. And so that's another approach that has been used and then linked into larger data sets. The other complexity that from what you mentioned is surveys. So when people have consented to their Indigenous identity being used, then there's another layer of complexity, because it's sort of like, I identified as a First Nations person. I want my, you know, Canadian Community Health Survey data to be used with that identity there. But then where does the sort of collective consent and governance come from? And we can't overlook the fact that we still need, it may not be a nation-based collective consent and governance, we still need the community engagement part. That's why it's so important that those two things are distinct. Even where there's not clear governance, engagement is key, because you don't want to be telling the story because of First Nations people using data if you don't have the collective consent of, in some way, of First Nations people.
Amazing. Well, thank you again so much for sharing all of your knowledge here for us today, and all of your expertise. I know, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the chat, but there's been a number of people offering their thanks and their thoughts. So I'll let you look through that afterwards, but thank you again. I want to remind all of our attendees to please fill out the post-webinar survey. And finally, to join us this Wednesday for our next webinar from 12 to 1 on how to organize Indigenous data. So thank you so much again, Dr. Walker, and we hope to see all of you on Wednesday.